around land and our belonging. And what the Kukapa people had said is that land does not belong to us. It belongs to those who have walked through it and now they're gone. And it belongs to those who are not born yet. So that it's very important to not forget. And that's one of the things that we are honoring today. So thank you. And also to honor that Kukapa knowledge and also the Kukapa way of also thinking on how the problems with the land and on the earth started with that.
Good morning, everybody. So good to see you all. This is a little bit of an introduction into Territories of Transition, which we started about 2 years ago. And our goal as Culture Lab was to look at the narrative space around the land ownership narrative. And we did about 6 months of research, and we collected data from different sources, social media data, and some interviews with different people. And the result was this report. And if we go to the next slide, we can just give you an overview of some of the key ideas that we found.
The idea of land ownership sits at the heart of an extraction-based global operating system. US and European land laws have been created by the logic of separation and extraction of the natural world to reinforce class hierarchies, elite ownership, structural racism, and the enclosure and privatization of the commons. In the chaos and breakdown of capitalist modernity, we are seeing ancient and new approaches that are recasting the meaning of everyday life while building new pathways for meaningful systems change. Decolonization. How may we transmute the poison of guilt into the medicine of reconciliation? What do relational and ritual reparation looks like between communities that survived enslavement, genocide, and displacement, and the descendants of enslavers and colonizers? Land back to right relations. Interdependence. The cycle of privilege keeps us deadlocked into a repeating pattern of violence and entropy. To be interdependent is to understand the connection between all beings. As we care and defend the land that sustains us, we are equally embraced. Our healing is bound together, and our liberation entangled. Radical relationality. We cannot disconnect the disposition of land from the disposition of people and culture. When we begin to heal our relationship with the earth, to liberate land from ownership, possession, extraction, and abuse, we begin to heal the trauma that lives in our communities. The territory is our body. In times of system crisis, we need bolder, radical solutions that are fundamentally relational. Territories of Transition aims to re-enchant public imagination around the ideals of the commons as a response to our social and ecological crisis, to draw attention to the pluriverse of alternative ways of knowing, being, and living with the land.
Great. So that was a quick overview, and I think even with that, we probably want to explain a little bit more about the research and our purpose. Before we get into the narrative communities, just quickly want to say, like, the main goal of the research was to try and find ways in which we could unite all the different movements that are working on the issue of land ownership. And so we did a very diverse net. We used a very diverse net of data from social media data, and to try and find where were the most interesting conversations and what we call narrative communities within the narrative landscape. We identified these 7 communities, and these communities were specific to the time in which we did the research, but I think we could also consider them as archetypal, and we'll go into that in a little bit, so don't worry about that right now. So just give you a quick overview. We found the first community was looking at community land trusts, which are shared land, which have it's a governance structure that is centered on shared ownership and governance of pieces of land. And this has quite a long background that stems from the 60s and the Black Civil Rights movement in the US, for example. And so has a really radical root, but we find not so radical in everyday current terms. The second one, of course, was the land back movement, which we see as epitomizing the decolonial movements and narrative communities within the narrative space. And this should be, obviously familiar to all of us. The key question that this narrative community is sitting with is how we return land that was stolen and how we return them into the custodianship of indigenous leadership. The third one was a little bit more nuanced, and we see these communities more in the policy advocacy space. So a lot more, it has a lot more of the taste of the NGO world. This was the rights of nature, so which is essentially a legal framework that endows rights or sentience to bioregions or aspects of nature, for example, a river or a specific tract of land. And in many ways, we see this interesting resonance between what's happening in the land back movement in this return of land to indigenous custodianship, but also in the return of land to itself, which was quite fascinating. The fourth group, Comunalidad, was a very specific group that we found in Mexico, and was interesting because it exemplified not just decolonial perspectives or kind of legal frameworks, but it was interested specifically in the relationship of human beings to the land and developing a shared practice and a shared way of living with the land, which was really fascinating and kind of probably the most radical from a narrative perspective that we found in the narrative space. The fifth group, food sovereignty, was shifting the kind of narrative around food security, which has been predominant in the globalization conversation for many years, even decades, but looking specifically at food sovereignty. So tying food and food sovereignty into the question of land and land sovereignty, which is very interesting. At the time, we found another community called Ecocidio, which was looking specifically at framing the land ownership narrative within the framework of ecological crisis. So a lot of this group was specifically in the Spanish area, Spanish-speaking Latin American area, but is looking at like the crisis, the climate crisis within the framework of land ownership. And then the seventh group was bioregionalism, which is kind of similar to rights of nature, but looking at developing or framing land ownership within a bioregionalist perspective. Again, very much rooted in a policy advocacy space. So those are the key communities we identified. If we go to the next slide, we can show you what we did in terms of mapping. And as we go through the process, you will learn more about how we map the narrative space. Each of these circles represent one of the narrative communities we just showed. The size of the circle represents its power within the space, and the position represents its place related to these four axes. So in terms of the vertical, we find different understandings of human beings and their relationship to land. Going below, we find enclosure, which is the typical colonial perspective, where land is understood as an enclosure, so is life force. And up into the top of this spectrum, we find instances in which land is seen as a relational phenomena, something that we are embedded with, interdependent with, and reliant on. Then the horizontal axis, we have critical perspectives, and these perspectives were very critical of the system, looking at ways in which they could shift the system or provide resistances towards what was currently happening. And on the right-hand side, we have more creative approaches. And this really just means, this could be a bit of a false dichotomy, but it's useful for the mapping. It means they were looking at alternative ways of dealing with the crisis that they're in. So in a few things to kind of like point out, we found the most power in communities B and F, which were the land back movement and the ecocidio movement, which were both critical, are putting forward a position of critiquing the system and trying to shift the system from that perspective. Then in the next more powerful cluster was A and E, which is essentially the community land trusts and food sovereignty movements, which are not very critical of the system. And although they are offering alternatives, are not very practical or, let's say, engaging in their activities. And they really represent the kind of middle of the narrative space, very the median in terms of what narrative communities are there. Then in community G and C, bioregionalism, rights of nature, these are the more policy advocacy or the legal frameworks or policy frameworks in which to think about land. And then finally, we found D, communalidad, which we found the closest to radical relationality in that it was expressing this deep unification with land, unification with the more than human world, and was also creative in that it was looking at alternative ways of knowing and being. So to kind of summarize into the next slide, we identified 3 domain areas that we found, and these 3 domain areas essentially represent the 3 approaches, at a very broad level, the 3 what we call narrative frames that address land ownership or are providing alternative ways to think of land ownership. The first one was the decolonization movement, which was looking at reparations and return of the land. So really taking this idea of land ownership through the lens of colonization and how to reverse some of those activities. The second one, and in the first one, we see the communities like land back and, you know, different land movements across North America and Latin America. The second one was the interdependence frame. And this community was much less critical in its perspective, but focused on how do we understand land as this interdependence between peoples and places and the more than human. And here we see the food sovereignty movement, the community land trust movement, and all these kind of different movements that were looking specifically at how we create new systems to understand and express this interdependence. And then the most interesting for us is the radical relationality domain. And we see here the frame is the territory is our bodies are the territory. And so in this way, there's a unification of both the people, the place, and the future. And so these 3 domain areas are the way we stepped into this current intervention stage and kind of shapes our strategy moving forward. If we want to take a little step deeper, we can go to the next slide. And on this slide, we can look, this is not too important right now. This is more when we go into the details of the narrative work. But if we look at the core metaphor under decolonization, it's the metaphor of reclamation, taking back reclaiming what was taken. Its logic is the most direct route to justice is to return the land back. The core values are reclamation, reparations, and reconciliation. And the potential reframes, the potential way this community could start talking about land back was this idea of land back to right relations. In the interdependence domain, we see the core metaphor as we all connected. The logic was survival depends on high levels of cooperation. And the potential reframes that we see here is our healing is bound together, our liberation is entangled with humans more than humans and land itself. And then finally, the radical relationality domain, the core metaphor is the network of life, meaning we're all connected, we're all interdependent. The logic here was the territories of our living beings that we are part of. We exist through reciprocal relationship and kinship. The potential reframes here are the territories, our bodies are the territory, we are the earth healing itself, territories, kin. participation in the mystery. So once again, this is a lot of the detail of our narrative strategy. And as we move through this process, a lot of this will become more clear. If you would like to go ahead and deep dive, we'll share the links to the report, our research report, and you're welcome to have a look through that. And then in an overall trope, we wanted to, right now we feel that the narrative space is stuck in this conversation around commons and natural resources. And we now want to move to territories of transition, the current frame. So in this frame, we believe that we're in a transition from an anthropocentric worldview, a capitalist worldview, a capitalist scene, into a post-anthropocentric, post-capital perspective. And we see territories of transition as pointing to all the different ways or different transition pathways this can occur.
So now, one of the main reasons why we do a cultural hack process, and some reflections that we have made up around culture and the Anthropocene, and the effects of some of the behaviors and the effects of culture, and how do we see that from the culture hack method perspective. So in the process of talking about culture, Anthropocene, and the relationship about culture and cultural change and stories, we know that there is a deep relation between storytelling and our cultures, because storytelling is fundamental part of all cultures through the world. So since you can see in this picture, in the cave of the dreams, there was this first handmade painting that was telling about the presence of someone very, very long time ago, very 1,000 years ago. So storytelling is fundamental parts at all times of humanity. We are making sense of the world we're living through histories. So that's why it's very important to talk about the power of storytelling and how it is related, and that has been part of every culture in every time that humanity has existed. And the storytelling is also related of how we are telling stories in every culture. And stories are the way that we organize, that we communicate and give meaning to the events of daily life, the ideas, relationships, and feelings that we perceive, and also what we have dreamed and imagined. So in different indigenous cultures, cosmogonies, and ways of living and being in the world, we have developed very different stories to make sense and to communicate and to create relations. So what can you see in this picture? Someone want to share? What do you see in this picture?
Tlacuache or a possum. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with constellations, but at least it looks like a possum.
Yeah, but you say important words: a possum, a tlacuache, and a constellation. Okay. So you saw stars in the sky, an animal, and the idea of building constellations was creating a story. How some stars in the sky, you can see a shape of a possum on it, and that makes sense for someone because they can relate to it because it's part of their territory. But for example, in other parts of the world, that's not a possum, that it's Capricorn or that it's Taurus, right? And because it's part of other system of interrelated stories. And those are the narratives. And the narratives are also systems of logic, values, metaphors, and common sense through which we understand and interact with the world. So for example, here in these constellations, different cultures and different parts of the world had created narratives and systems to count time, had created systems to explain the movement of the universe and the sky, and also that have told stories about the necessity of moving. And they are also relating how the stars are moving in the sky in the phases where we can plant something in the soil, where we can cut our hair, where we can travel, where we can also put our cities and our communities in specific places. So this set of interrelated stories that are the narratives are also the logics, the metaphors that had created and interact the world that we're living in. And these narratives for our communities were something, but also there are some other narratives. And that relationship that we're shaping those stories is what we now do call culture. And the narratives give shape to cultures. The culture refers to the normative values and belief systems that are coordinating human activity. So in this process of thinking on culture hacking and how can communication actions can shape culture, we see narrative shapes. We see normative values and belief systems that can coordinate our activities, our actions. So, for example, for our ancestors, as I was sharing, how reading into the sky, looking into the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, they were creating normative values, belief systems that were shaping for our health, for our constructions, for our architecture, for medicine and healthcare. So how our culture refers to that. And that's the power of stories, the power of narratives that are shaping our activities, that are shaping our actions on the daily basis. So that is for us very important to name on the necessity and the possibility on changing stories, changing narratives to change culture. And that also came with the problem also of what we are living right now, and also how the different cultural models hold implicit understandings of what constitutes the self and how they relate to the other. And there are some ways of living, some cultures where there is not a very clear separation, as in the Western culture, of the self and the other, that we're talking about our entanglement, our interconnection, and how we are connected to each other, that we do not see separate from nature, for example, in some indigenous communities and cultures, that we do not see ourselves outside, that we do exist as an individual system, but also that we are entangled with another big web of life. So in our cultural models, how we understand the self and the other, how do we relate to it? And that is also coming with power, and the power of the stories and the Western culture as a power and as a way of understanding the world that has been imposed. In this picture, we can see the first video and photograph that was recorded by the Lumiere machine. And the brothers Lumieres, when they started to do storytelling through video, they captured this image. It is a train station, it is white people, and you're seeing their culture, you're seeing their ways of getting dressed, you're seeing their transportation. And the problem with the story is that it has been sold as universal story. You know, the universal history is the story that has been put into the books, into the movies, into different spaces of storytelling. And that is the power of stories. Who is telling a story? From what perspective they're doing it? And what way and through what means? So that's why this example of the Lumiere brothers sharing the first videotaped images to the world was telling a story. Who was telling it? What was their perspective? Through which way? Through what means? So the power of storytelling also resides in that way that we now are seeing who is telling, who is the most story that has been told. It has been told by white, Western, and also the stories are coming with knowledge. And for us as indigenous communities, especially, the plurality of knowledge in the world has been exterminated by the monoculture of narratives imposed by systems of oppression, by violence. So for us as indigenous communities, we have different knowledges, different systems, as in this picture is shown, a way of counting a story, of counting the time, on representing the diversity of activities and actions done by our ancestral cultures. So this plurality of knowledge through genocide, through ecocide, has been exterminated, and a monoculture of narrative has been imposed. And we have seen it now through Netflix, through Amazon, through even the universities, how the monoculture has been imposed in different parts of the world. And also it has come with a lot of violence. So there is power in this storytelling, in the way that the monoculture has been imposed in different spaces. But the narratives for us are living systems. And that's why it's very important to connect how these narratives, the storytelling, had power relations on it, and also different systems of knowledge. And the narratives are still alive. The narratives are born, they grow, they change, they reproduce, they evolve, and also they can die. And the narratives had a visible part: stories, memes, communication actions, attitudes, messages, images, everything that we can perceive through our senses. And also they have a hidden part that is the less that we can feel with some of our senses in the most practical, material way. The hidden part are the cultural structures that the narratives have on them, the metaphors they are using, the logics they are following, the ideologies they are feeding, the frames that they are showing, the values that they are strengthening. So that is very important to understand the structure of a narrative, because there are systems that are living systems, and they have a visible and a hidden part that every time we tell a story, it comes with them. And in this process of understanding the living systems of the narratives, we also know that, and we see that every time we talk about the different systems. And for example, in the indigenous ways of telling stories, and the way that we want to hack the Anthropocene and the culture on the Anthropocene. So in this first module of the culture hack method, we have been analyzing the structure of narratives and also finding the ways of understanding them so we can transform it. So you will see our loved sister Shanti giving some information about that.
Culture can be defined as a social domain that emphasizes the practices, discourses, and material expressions of a community. In the age of the Anthropocene, it is important for us to have a very nuanced understanding of culture. In the last half a century, we have seen new social and cultural systems emerge, such as globalization, neoliberalism, and social dictatorships, all of which gave warrant and rise to rampant resource extraction, ecological destruction, exponential economic inequality, and dehumanizing poverty. It is therefore incredibly important that we fully understand the nuance and complexity of the cultural systems that have birthed and sustained the Anthropocene. In contrast to its traditional Enlightenment definition, where culture meant the evolution of the human condition, we can see that culture is not your friend. Culture is not our friend. And because culture is not your friend, we need a much more contextually relevant definition of culture. Culture should be understood as the normative values and belief systems that coordinate human activity. Through these normative values and belief systems, culture creates systems of meaning that determine how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. The culture of the Anthropocene creates systems of meaning that are inherently dualistic, binary, creating distinctions between social, political, and ecological categories. For example, nature versus culture, subject versus object, knower, object to be known, human, non-human, self, other, black, white. I mean, all of us contribute to and are affected by culture, yet some, more than others, have a disproportionate responsibility and benefit from culture. Therefore, culture is both constructed and emergent, being simultaneously visible and invisible. We can identify the values of a particular culture simply by making empirical observations within its context, by looking at the social, political, and ecological outcomes produced by its cultural system. Understanding that culture delineates a set of distinctions, assumptions, norms, and beliefs about the world is essentially the key point here. This nuanced understanding of culture can help us to develop ways to critically assess our cultural systems and create the conditions for the syntropic, life-affirming evolution of our cultures.
So as Tere put you in the chat, don't worry, we're going all this process together to be, going into depth little by little. So please relax. We're just beginning this journey. So culture affects the world. The culture refers to the normative values and belief systems that coordinate human activity. Through these normative values, culture enacts ideological models that give meaning to how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. These systems of meaning make implicit distinctions about social, political, and ecological categories, for example, as nature, culture, subject, object, knower, object to be known, human, non-human, self, and other. For example, capitalist culture puts money above life, and the land is a commodity that can be divided and sold. So this is how culture affects the world. And culture affects the being. The basis of culture is a generative model describing the relationship between the self and the other. Any cultural model holds implicit understandings of what constitutes self. The relationship here is mediated by constructs that define the world through this lens of self, and this includes moral judgments, truth claimings, values determinations, ontological lenses, and theoretical models of reality. So for example, in Western culture, that culture separates people, the self, from nature, the other, and rewards individualism. So that is how culture affects being, the self, the constructs, the others. And for us, as part of the culture hack method, it's very important to understand that also culture has effects, that ascertain which categories are prioritized by a given culture by looking at the social, political, and ecological outcomes that this cultural system produces. For example, in capitalism, the impact of capitalist and colonialist culture in the network of life is imbalanced, and that results in the global climate crisis that we're facing. And also on our reflection on Anthropocene and Capitalocene, these cultures, although there is evidence that we can measure the anthropogenetic effects from pre-industrial times, we see that the greatest effects from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the capitalist culture, has affected the planet. Thereafter, with the advent of increasing consumption by the global north, the rich people, we have seen an escalating anthropogenetic impact in the last 50 years, and those correspond to neoliberal culture. So the global north, the rich people, is responsible for 92% of the contribution to the climate catastrophe in terms of historical emissions and material footprint, that is colonial culture. And in this period, we see the emergence of new social and cultural systems, for example, globalization and social dictatorships that give warrant to rampant extractivism and ecocide, and also the exponential economic inequality and poverty. So for us, what do we call culture hacking and why it's important to change that culture? We believe that the part of the cultural evolutionary process, the culture change, requires an understanding of the deep logic, narratives, cultural codes, and belief structures of the dominant system, while seeding and practicing life-centric alternatives. And we call to that culture hacking. And when we talk about life-centric alternatives, we're talking about anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, anti-racist, anti-apartheid, anti-patriarchal. So this is for us, what do we call culture change and also culture hacking. So as part of this process, for us has been very important to understand the deep logic within the narratives and the ideas that sustain these cultural processes that has been imposed with genocide and violence in our territories. So for us, this is part of the basis of the model of the culture hacking method. And for us, it's very important to share it with you. So it is necessary to understand that we have developed and also sharing now with you a tool to make very deep understanding and also critiques to the narratives, stories, and communication actions that we're doing. It's a critical change thinking tool to analyze the narratives. So we're going very slow with this. This is just the beginning of this process of understanding this narrative change process. And also, when we talk about the anthropogenic, the human-driven effects, it's important to understand right now that the very different cultures is diverse, and there has been some cultures that has been imposed to others that has perpetuated the violence. And also the necessity of understanding the evolution in the narratives as a cooperation and co-creation process, not the process of competing to see who is the most strongest that will survive, right? So it's very important for us to address that in the culture hacking process. And that's why the co-creation process of doing a narrative change activity is also done in collectively, and we are driving this collective laboratory to co-create this space with all you.